It's a matter of record that during October of 1979, in the early period of the 1980 Democratic presidential primary campaign, I issued a statement nationwide which warned that continuation of the policies just recently then announced that month by Paul Volcker and Jimmy Carter would lead to the outbreak of a major recession during the spring of 1980 and would lead to a new world depression during the course of the years beyond. In November of that year, the first LaRouche-Riemann quarterly report was issued, projecting the first major signs of a downturn of the U.S. economy to erupt by about the end of February 1980. That downturn appeared on time, as forecast. At the beginning of 1980, my colleagues and I presented a more detailed forecast of the way in which continuation of the Carter-Volcker policies would lead in the direction of a new worldwide depression. At every step over the period since November 1979, the U.S. economy has followed exactly the pattern that we forecast at the beginning of 1980. We warned that a continuation of the Carter-Volcker policies would lead us into a new depression through a series of recessions and temporary apparent upturns. As we forecast, the first recession covered the period from February through the summer of 1980 and was followed by a temporary leveling off of the recession until the summer of 1981. Between the summer of 1981 and the fall of 1982, a deep and accelerating new recession occurred, followed by a leveling off of the rate of recession from the beginning of 1983 into the beginning of 1984. Since the first quarter of 1984, a new accelerating recession has been underway, leading us into the May outbreak of the international financial crisis. In other words, at the end of 1979, my colleagues and I forecast that unless the policies of Carter and Volcker were dumped, the United States economy would go through a series of roller coaster-like ups and downs until we reach the threshold for a worldwide financial collapse like that which set off the Great Depression in 1931. President Reagan continued the policies of the Carter-Mondale administration. So, we have now entered a new financial collapse spiral in exactly the way my colleagues and I have repeatedly forecast since the end of 1979. I must emphasize that both Washington and the international banking community have not only been fully aware of my forecasts, they have insisted, sometimes almost violently, that my analysis was wrong. Events have now proven that I've been correct, and that they have been blind fools of the sort who refuse to learn anything from the history of the last Great Depression. Just to pin this point down for you, look at my record on the issue of the debtors cartel just formed by the governments of Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil. Toward the close of 1981, I warned that the foreign debt of the countries of Ibero-America was about to explode. I recommended that these countries and the Reagan administration take a series of cooperative actions to prevent that debt crisis from exploding. During the spring of 1982, I was the first to use the term debt bomb to describe the debt crisis which was about to explode. During June or July of that year, I conveyed to various governments of Ibero-America and to our own government my recommendations for immediate action to prevent this debt crisis from triggering a collapse in the solvency of the U.S. banking system and thus triggering the conditions for a new worldwide financial collapse. During August 1982, the debt bomb exploded in Mexico. For a period of approximately an hour during that month, the entire world financial system was on the edge of a total collapse. However, the Reagan administration refused to accept my proposals, which could have stopped the world financial crisis right at that time. Instead, the Reagan administration brought in Henry A. Kissinger and adopted Kissinger's policies. My proposal for solving the financial crisis of the Western Hemisphere is called Operation Warz. This is the name of a report which I prepared at the request of leading circles in South America and Mexico, a report which I submitted to those governments and to our own government at the beginning of August, just weeks before the Mexico crisis exploded. Since August 1982, Henry Kissinger, Kissinger's associate Lane Kirkland, and officials of the State and Treasury Department have concentrated the major part of their political efforts in Washington and in Mexico and South America in an effort to prevent the policies I present in Operation Warz from being adopted. These collaborators of Kissinger have been insisting around the world that they have stopped Operation Warz's policies and that the governments of Mexico and South America would never organize a debtors cartel. On May 19th, following the crisis of Continental Illinois, the four leading nations of Ibero-America organized that debtors cartel and announced policies echoing those presented in Operation Warz. The new depression which erupted this May could still be stopped. For example, if President Reagan would enact the same policies which I shall list for you at the close of this broadcast, and do that right now, he could stop the depression. Since I am a patriotic citizen of this country, he would have available to him all of my special expertise and my personal influence in other countries to assist him in making his efforts a success. Every patriotic Democrat would demand that I act to assist President Reagan in that way, and I would accept that demand of my patriotic fellow Democrats. This would be personally very difficult for the President to do politically. This would mean that the President would have to make a break with Henry Kissinger circles and also break with key factions in the Treasury and State Departments, as well as with his own White House Palace Guard. I do not know whether President Reagan is able to rise above the pragmatic delusions of an election campaign year. On the basis of his performance over the past 12 months, I fear that his tendency for opportunistic wishful thinking would lead him to the kind of disaster which brought down Herbert Hoover in 1932. In that case, the only hope the United States might have to get out of this depression is placing me in the White House next January. If Mondale or any other of the candidates approved by Mrs. Pamela Churchill Harriman were to become president, there is more than 100% certainty that the United States will be virtually destroyed as a nation by the combined effects of a New World Depression and Soviet aggression. With all my personal limitations, of which I am far more conscious than any of you could be, I am the only possible choice for President of the United States at this time, unless we could assume that President Reagan himself would change course dramatically right now. If President Reagan is not willing to constitute a bipartisan emergency government of the patriotic factions of both parties, to implement the kinds of measures I shall list at the close of this broadcast, I must become President of the United States next January. You, as you watch and listen to this broadcast, wherever you are sitting or standing at this moment, you, as an individual citizen of this republic, are facing one of the toughest decisions of your life. You must ask yourself the question, is putting this guy into power in Washington the only choice I have if I do not wish to put our country and my family through another Great Depression, worse than one of the 1930s? Whether you or I like that question or not, it is the question you are facing. This is the tough question every sane voter must face during this primary election. The thousands of Democratic convention delegates and the millions of you watching this broadcast today represent the political power to put me into the position in Washington, D.C., where I can provide my proven expertise to steer this country of ours out of this new Herbert Hoover depression. I shall report to you now the main elements of the package of executive orders and emergency legislation I would issue within the first hour after being sworn in as your next president.